Hello everyone, this is Nephis here. Thank you for checking out this guide to PvE Nightblade tanking. The Nightblade tank has been the most requested class actually after I posted my previous ultimate guide, which was on Necromancer tanks back in the Elsewhere patch. As always with my longer videos, I have included timestamps in the video description below and in the comment section for mobile devices, so feel free to skip ahead to whichever part you're interested in. A lot of people have been curious as to why endgame raiders had started picking up Nightblade tanks, and this guide will sort of answer that question and more. Just like my previous ultimate guide to the Necromancer PvE tanks, I won't really be going into specific builds or setups, and will make Nightblade tank build videos just as I did for Necromancers for specific content later on. This video is going to be a general overview of the skills and item sets and traits we're interested in as Nightblade tanks and so forth. Regarding the playstyle and concept of the PvE Nightblade tank, it's actually a pretty active and fun playstyle. Expect to be the most active during trash fights, however, in either trials or dungeons, and more conservative during boss fights. It's not as active or arguably as responsive as a couple other tanking classes, but still definitely enjoyable, fresh breath of air playstyle. The concept of our PvE Nightblade tank is mostly centered around ultimate generation and heavy mitigation, notably with Grim Resolve and Major Evasion. Now we'll be going over the class skill lines and passives of the Nightblade tank and see what skills we're going to take and what skills we're largely going to ignore for the most part for PvE tanking. Now the Assassination skill line, it obviously doesn't sound very much like a skill line for tanks. You know, when you think of a tank, you're thinking, oh, big, heavy, armor-wearing dude, blocking all the attacks, whatever, right? However, there are actually, surprisingly, a few skills we need to consider and take from the Assassination skill tree for the Nightblade PvE tank as of the Skill Breaker patch. In future patches, if you're watching this in future patches, there may be adjustments, who knows, no one knows the future. Deathstroke, this is the Assassination ultimate that we're going to have to consider as tanks. Well, Nephis, why would we consider something that does damage as a tank? Well, if we morph it, and we look at the morph skills, we have Soul Harvest and Incapitating Strike. Incapitating Strike, it's going to be actually the go-to morph. It's very debatable which morph you want to take, especially for 4-man dungeons. But for trials, it'll probably be Incapitating Strike, because Soul Harvest, yes, you do get a ultimate, like 7 ultimate back every time you kill an enemy. But honestly, when's the last time you got the last shot on an enemy in trials? For dungeons, this may be a little different if you spec more into, you know, Nightblade tanking with some hybrid DPS. But it's still unlikely that compared to a straight up DPS build that you're going to get the last hit on mobs that'll die to get the benefit of this harvest, to get the benefit of the ultimate generation. So we're going to go with Incap Strike. Now what does Incap Strike offer in comparison to Soul Harvest? What Soul Harvest doesn't have compared to Incap is that you gain Reeve, which restores 85 to... It's a variable actually here, once you level it. You actually gain 100 magic and stamina when you deal damage with a light or heavy attack on an enemy with a negative effect active on them. This is pretty much free resources every time you deal damage with a light or heavy attack on a boss or anything that has a negative effect on them. That can include Infallible Aether, that can include obviously armor penetration debuff, that can pretty much include anything. So pretty much all the time you're gonna have Reeve active from Incap Strike, and you're gonna have put this on your sword and board bar, because you can easily block cancel light attacks and heavy attacks with block, as you can see. So Reeve is going to be a very interesting option to have. Incap Strike is going to be our front bar ultimate. Assassin's Blade. This is going to be a skill that we're going to ignore for the most part. It's an execute. Again, if you want to spec more into sort of a hybrid tank and DPS setup, which I don't really recommend for certain content, you can. But again, we're going to largely ignore Assassin's Blade for PvE tanking. Teleport Strike. Now, someone actually asked me a pretty good question on the YouTube comments on a previous video. What do you think, or actually was it in Discord? I'm not exactly sure, but whoever you are, it was a good question. So Teleport Strike. Now, they asked if it's worth running as a PvE Nightblade tank to inflict minor vulnerability on the target for 8 seconds. And minor vulnerability can come from shock-based damage and the Infallible Aether set, which is a very common and a must-have set for most healers in endgame content. However, there's 2 reasons why you probably don't want to do it. One thing, again, a healer would most likely have it, and if a healer doesn't have it, it'll come from other sources. And it's like sort of a waste of bar space, but if you do have bar space for it, sure, you can consider it. The minor vuln, I don't think, is really gonna make or break it for you as a tank, so that's something to consider, but sort of in the back. We'll keep this in the back of our heads for a second. Blur. Blur is surround yourself in a phantasmic aura to gain major evasion. And for those of you who don't know what major evasion is or how they changed it, it basically decreases damage done to you from AoE attacks by 25%. And it has a really long duration, as you can see, 26 seconds of major evasion. That's pretty insane. There's a lot of stuff in the game, in PvE content, especially in Veteran Sunspire, Veteran anything, honestly, Trials, that a lot of attacks are considered area of effect damage, and they do hurt quite a bit. So 25% damage reduction on AoE damage done to you, especially as a tank, it's a fantastic skill to have, and I do highly recommend you get it. You also have the choice between Phantasmal Escape and Mirage. Now, Phantasmal Escape I can see being used more for PvP, but we're strictly talking about PvE tanking. So we're going to go with Mirage as it offers us minor resolve and minor ward. A nice bit of extra resistance that we're not going to get from our current toolkit at this time. So let's see, we're going to take that out and put it here. There's Mirage. Now that's a pretty essential skill to have for certain damage heavy fights. I can name a few bosses besides the Veteran Sunspire Dragons. We have St. Olms. We have, let's see, the Warrior, Shieldro, the Mages, AoEs on AA hard mode. We also do have a lot of AoE damage from the poison damage in Veteran Sanctum Ophidia, so that will mitigate this. It's pretty intense. So we have Mark Target. Now, Mark Target, this is another skill to consider. Basically exposing enemies' weaknesses to afflict them with Major Fracture and Major Breach, reducing their physical and spell resistance by 5,280. This is going to be the same as Puncture here. So we're going to take this into consideration for now, but this will be for fights specifically when you'll be at range. So as of Scalebreaker right now, you can range tank the Locustes on Locustes hard mode in Veteran Sunspire. So this is something to consider if you're not going to be up against the dragon and piercing him to inflict Major Fracture, Major Breach. And this is also a consideration as well for certain PvE forming content as well. So if you had to take a morph, you'll probably, it doesn't really matter at that point. You're just honestly taking the skill if you have to use it for the base Major Fracture, Major Breach, but that is about it. Grim Focus. Now this is a very, very interesting skill that they changed for the Nightblade class toolkit. We are going to actually take it, and let me read it to you guys. Focus your senses for 20 seconds, reducing your damage taken by 2% with every light or heavy attack, up to 5 times. Basically, what this means is they sort of changed Grim Focus from being a purely damage skill to sort of a tank skill. And what I mean by this is, as the tooltip said, you're going to be mitigating your damage taken by 2% with every light or heavy attack up to 5 times, so that's 10% mitigation. While active, hitting an enemy with 5 light or heavy attack converts this ability into Assassin's Will, allowing you to fire a Spectral Arrow for half cost to deal blah 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 damage and healing for 33% damage dealt if you are within 7 meters of the enemy. Now, a trick here is you can do either morph. However, you want to take the Merciless Resolve as a PvE tank because you don't want to invest too much stamina usage, because for stamina you need to break free, you need to dodge roll, you need to also, most importantly, block. So you don't want to take too much out of your stam pool. So you want to go with Merciless Resolve when choosing the morph. Now the trick to using Merciless Resolve, and they had to actually nerf this slightly because of how it's calculated. Damage mitigation actually is calculated in a way with the formula that I believe it's applied after the formula, meaning that it's actually a pretty huge ton of mitigation. So the trick with Merciless Resolve here is to proc it, and then yes, you will build up, let's say this is the 4th light attack, 5th light attack, and you get the Spectral Bow proc, but you don't fire it. Basically what happens here is, as long as you're in combat and you don't fire it, you're gonna keep the Merciless Resolve damage mitigation. So as you can see, the buff is over, the skill has ended, but on my character sheet it's still going as long as I'm in combat, and it says here reduce damage taken by 3%, stacking up to 5 times. And the effect is lost once you fire the bow. So even if you misclick or press the button and it comes to active again, there's generally no need to shoot it off. The heal is not that much in my opinion anyway. Also, but yeah, that's the trick to Merciless Resolve. Once you proc it and you enter the fight and you're in combat, you're done. You don't fire it, you're done. And that's why we're going to actually put this skill on the back bar once we're out of combat here. And then we're going to put this on the back bar here, right? So that's a very passive active skill we're going to have during our fights as a Nightblade PvE tank. So here we are with the Assassination passive abilities. Master Assassin, it's really honestly whatever, but we'll put points into it anyway because OCD, why not? Executioner, when an enemy dies within 2 seconds of being damaged by one of your assassination abilities, you restore 1876 magicka or stamina, whichever maximum is higher. So if you do have a higher max stam pool than a max magicka pool, you'll get the stamina back. If an enemy afflicted with, let's say, Spectral Bow or Marked Target, or even Incap, I guess if you want to, dies. So that's a pretty nice source of potential sustain for 4-man dungeon content. Pressure points. Now, this is going to be interesting as well, as weapon crit does affect things like vigor and magicka-based healing. So pressure points is also a consideration. Hemorrhage. Now, hemorrhage, this is the reason why a lot of people have started bringing Nightblade tanks into endgame. Hemorrhage says increase your crit damage by 5% with an assassination ability slot in. Dealing crit damage grants you and your group minor savagery, increasing your weapon crit rating by 1320 for 10 seconds, and that minor savagery is a significant passive to have for raid groups in Veteran Sunspire or wherever. And that's where the advantage of being a Nightblade tank comes in. You'll always be needed, or even if you're not a Nightblade tank and you're a Nightblade DPS, the minor savagery is very, very attractive for stamina DPS raid compositions. So this is a significant part, much like how minor toughness is on Wardens, a significant part of why the Nightblade tanks have been considered since the beginning of Elsewhere. So we're definitely going to have that, very useful for our stam DPS. And you ask me, Nephis, how often do you actually crit as a tank to proc hemorrhage? Yeah, surprisingly, pretty much all the time, as long as you're light attacking, whatever. It's actually, it's pretty consistent, even if you have really low weapon crit. So don't worry too much about your actual crit rating. You'll most definitely activate hemorrhage no matter what. And so with that being said, we're going to move on to the Shadow skill line. As you can see, we haven't really picked up much. We're considering a lot of skills here. We've picked up Merciless Resolve for the back bar. We have Mirage on the front bar with Incap Strike for the Reeve. And for the Shadow skill, this is where things will get interesting. The ultimate, Consuming Darkness. Conjure a ring of shadow, reducing the movement speed of enemies by 70% and granting you and your allies major protection, reducing your damage taken by 30%. So if you and your groups or teams are in the Consuming Darkness AoE, you get 30% damage reduction on the damage output going to the group. This is a really strong ultimate to have for a lot of instances, boss 1 VHOF or even last boss VHOF. There's a lot of fights we can apply this ultimate to, which will save the group and help mitigate the damage, make things a lot easier for the DPS and the healers. This is definitely a consideration to have. We also do get a synergy out of it. If people can see the synergy. The synergy of this skill is a little wonky at times still, even though they apparently fixed it. But yes, people can activate the synergy of consuming darkness, which does heal them for quite a bit. It also gives them like invisibility, which is kind of irrelevant PvE. I guess it does draw the aggro away for a brief moment and increases their movement speed by 70%. The morphs we're going to be looking at here is Bolstering Darkness and Veil of Blades. Now, as a tank, you're not really concerned with doing more damage over time, so you're going to go with Bolstering Darkness. The amazing thing actually about Boasting Darkness is you no longer have to actually stay in the circle. So if we actually put it down, let's say your group comes in and they leave, they still have the major protection. It's pretty important that you understand this, because this means your group can still stay mobile and you still gain the major protection even after stepping out of it, post stepping inside of it. So as you can see, once the skill goes away, the major protection goes away. But this is a pretty interesting ultimate to take a look at for certain raid scenarios and definitely for main content, because this allows a way for groups to think more about their positioning, potential positioning. I think a pretty neat way to think about Locust's Hard Midfight and Veteran Sunspire is to have a Nightblade tank or somebody who's a Nightblade put down Bowstring Darkness in the middle of the room, have everyone touch it right before the beam phase starts, and then everyone gets major protection just like that. There doesn't seem to be a cap on it. So this is definitely a skill we're going to keep in the back of our heads for now. Very useful group utility skill. Veiled Strike, again, not really something we really need for Nightblade PvE tanks. Doesn't really, I mean, it does give some off balance uptime, but again, not kind of irrelevant in the larger picture. Shadow Cloak, now this is going to be a skill we definitely need to pick up. We have Shadowy Disguise and we have Dark Cloak. Obviously, Shadowy Disguise we don't need for PvE. For PvP, definitely you're invisible. And for PvE, we have Dark Cloak. And shroud yourself in Protective Shadow to heal for almost 3k every 1 second for over 6 seconds. This portion of the ability scales off your max health, and this is a pretty important skill to keep in mind now. If you ever watched my Necromancer guide for tanking in PvE, the skills that say this portion of the ability scales off your max health, or the heal scales off your max health, is really important, because that means as a tank, you're getting a really strong heal as opposed to doing a heal that's based off of max stamina or weapon damage or spell damage or max magicka. So we're definitely going to take Dark Cloak, and we also gain minor protection reduction. You know, that's an 8% damage reduction, which is pretty huge. I mean, the difference between having no minor protection and minor protection is significantly noticeable, especially for DPS and tanks. Like, you'll definitely notice, you know, hey, without minor protection, I'm taking this much damage, and with minor protection, you'll feel like, oh, that's not that much damage. That's how noticeable minor protection is in a lot of scenarios. Path of Darkness, we have a AoE, the Nightblade AoE. So basically, it's like a straight area of effect. What I mean by that is, I'll show you guys here. And as you can see, we also gain Major Expedition while we're walking inside of it, and gives us a slight Major Expedition boost once we exit it. And the effect persists for 4 seconds after leaving the path. So technically, this is a great skill to use if you're running through a dungeon or something, or running through trash. So definitely keep this in mind. As for the morphs, we have Twisting Path and Refreshing Path. I would personally go with Refreshing Path as a tank. You're not really going to be using this for most of the time. You're mostly going to be using this to move through stuff, or maybe as a source of extra, as a source of Major Expedition. You could be using it for like Veteran Cloud Rest and so on, but again, for Veteran Cloud Rest, you may have things that may affect your speed, like Swift Jewelry, so that's really up for debate if you want to use it or not, but it is something we're definitely going to consider. Aspect of Terror, Mass Hysteria, and we have Manifestation of Terror, basically the old classic fear that fears or stuns things now in both PvE and PvP and keeps them in place, as opposed to, you know, making people run away or making NPCs run away. And we have Manifestation of Terror. It's basically these things can put down on the ground, and if something walks into it, it triggers a trap and it scares them. And it's actually an AoE, So it causes them to cower in fear for 4 seconds if you put them down. Mass Hysteria is also a great option, so it's really up to you whether you want to use Mass Hysteria or the other morph. Mass Hysteria is sort of like Talons, but instead of, just rooting them, it does stun the ads as well. So it is really up to you. In this video, we're just going to take Manifestation of Terror just to show you guys what it looks like. Show you guys the example of Manifestation of Terror. It is pretty interesting, isn't it? But yeah, it's up to 6 enemies. And that is Manifestation of Terror, and that's a nice class CC ability to have. Summon Shade. Summon Shade, it's also an interesting ability to look at for Nightblade tanks. Personally, the only interesting part about it for PvE tanks would be the minor maim done. I can only see this being really useful for only like Asylum Sanctorium hard mode. You can definitely keep up Dark Shade or Shadow Image on Lothis. There are times when you cannot use Minor Maim from Heroic Slash from the Sword and Board skill line to keep up Minor Maim on Lothis to make sure his cone is Minor Maimed. So there is a couple instances maybe where you will be using Shade, and if you had to be using Shade, you'd definitely be using Dark Shade. I think it's a bit more consistent than Shadow Image in my opinion. As long as you cast it on the initial target, I believe. But otherwise, I think you can also go with the Shadow Image morph as well. And you can also have a nifty teleport skill. So really, it depends on your preference at this point. And for the Shadow passives, we have Refreshing Shadows. It's a pretty nice passive buff to our health, stamina, and magic recovery. So this is going to be pretty great for us, depending on the foods we're using or what our stats look like. We have Shadow Barrier, and this is going to be a huge reason as to why we may not be using Balance from the Mage's Guild skill line, which is a pretty nifty skill as well. It gives us Major Ward, Major Resolve for however many seconds, and also gives us some magic back in exchange for some health loss. However, I think that's the Shadow passive here. Shadow Barrier is going to be a huge part of the reason why we may not need Balance most of the time, especially in 4-man content. Because every time we use a Shadow ability, we get the Major Ward and Major Resolve. And this duration is increased by 25% for each piece of heavy armor equipped. So if you were afraid of, oh, that only lasts for 6 seconds, that is not that great, you do also have to realize that just with Dark Cloak and potentially Refreshing Path or something like that, you automatically get a 25% boost. So that's 13.5 seconds, which is not too bad, considering that other class Major Ward and Major Resolve abilities don't last for too long either compared to Balance. So this is definitely a really great passive to have, especially since you're going to be keeping up Dark Cloak, which also provides mind protection and a heal over time as well. So that's really good. Really good, great part for the Nightblade PV tank toolkit. So Dark Vigor, increase your max health by 2% for each Shadow ability slot in. So again, if you want to replace Incap Strike with this, or whatever, which again is up to you, you can play it however you want. We're going to have a potentially like 6% max health for, having Veil or Dark Cloak slot in and Dark Cloak slot in. And again, Path. There's a lot of things in play here, and Dark Vigor is definitely another nice addition to the PvE Nightblade tank toolkit. Dark Veil increases the duration of our Shadow abilities. Pretty nice to have, especially if we're going to consider using Path and Shade, and of course the Veil. For the Siphoning skill line, we're going to be looking at as a Nightblade PvE tank. We're going to be having Soul Shred. Now Soul Shred, this is a sort of toss-up in the air. You don't really need Soul Tether, unless, again, you want to do some sort of hybrid DPS tank build for 4-man content. It is quite a bit of damage even if you're in a tank spec, and it does heal you for the damage caused. But Soul Siphon will probably be the morph we're going to pick for certain content. I know a lot of people use this in progression groups, or used to use it in progression groups for veteran Cloudrest hard mode as Magblades. So this is a consideration potentially for very healing intensive fights, such as veteran Moongrave Fane hard mode, where you can get debuffed by the Horror or doing the mechanics and such. So this is definitely a consideration to have over Veil at times, because you may need that really strong burst heal over 4 seconds. And also, again, there's also a synergy provided to the group, which is pretty strong, and also we get Major Vitality, and that's an insane 30% healing received. So definitely keep this skill in mind. We're actually going to slot on the back bar here for very healing intensive situations. First skill of Siphoning we're going to be actually looking at is Strife, and the skill we're going to pick, as it says, it's going to steal the enemy's life force, deals X amount of magic damage, and heals me or another person for 57% of the damage inflicted every 2 seconds for 10 seconds. That means it's going to take 5 times total through its entire 10-second duration. And we have the choices between Swallow Soul or Funnel Health. Now, obviously Funnel Health will probably be the winner here, especially for 4-man content, because it heals up to 2 targets instead of 1. Swallow Soul, it does decrease the heals, but it also targets yourself. But so this is a matter of, okay, do I want a guaranteed heal, or do I want to run the risk of healing somebody else when I need a heal? So either way can go whichever one. I personally would probably go with Swallow Soul, because I definitely want that guaranteed heal for myself as a tank. The second skill in Siphoning we're going to be looking at is Malevolent Offering. We have Shrewd Offering and Healthy Offering. What the base skill does, it basically says sacrifice your essence. Is basically like balance from the Mage's Guild skill line, but it heals an ally in front of you for 5.3k health, but drains your own health over 8 seconds. And the Morph Shrewd Offering, it reduces the cost of the health you offer to give to the group. And Healthy Offering, sacrifice your essence, healing an ally in front of you for 5,360 health. But while your health is being drained for about 8 seconds, you gain Minor Mending, increasing your healing done by 8%. I see this skill more of a use for Nightblade healers rather than Nightblade tanks. The Minor Mending you get, I don't think would be a real game changer, honestly, for you as a tank, considering that you're already getting a lot from the shadow passes and your raw stats, and the fact that, you know, Dark Cloak is already healing you based off of your max health. So honestly, it's up to you if you want to try it out, but I'm just not really, I don't think a lot of tanks are attracted to the option of killing your health for just 8 seconds of Minor Mending. I guess there will be sometimes, again, for very healing intensive situations where you may need to use it, but again, I don't really see this as being more for Nightblade tanks in PvE, more for Nightblade healers, because I can see it being more useful for them. For the Cripple passive, this is also another source of a Nightblade skill that's sort of debatable to bring as a tank. I don't think either morph of Cripple, which is basically a dot and a snare. Debilitate also offers Minor Magicka Steal for about 10 seconds, but you kind of already have that with a healer in your group for trials, or a better source would be, you know, the LE Drain from the Destruction Staff skill line. So we're kind of going to be skipping over Cripple for a second here, and just to show you guys Crippling Grasp. It not, again, just more of an immobilization skill. And we have Siphoning Strikes, and this is going to be a key sustain skill we need as a Nightblade PvE tank. And we do have, it basically says imbue your weapons with soul stealing power, causing your light and heavy attacks to heal you for blah 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 health for 20 seconds. So each light or heavy attack can heal you for X amount of health for 20 seconds. Fully charged heavy attacks restore twice the value. So if I have this active on my bar or just on myself, Let's say put it on the back bar. And I'm gonna heavy attack. I get twice the amount of the tooltip, the health. But let's look at the morphs real quick. We have siphoning attacks, and the new effect is basically we restore up to 4,270 additional magicka when the effect ends, based on the length of time siphoning attacks was active. Plus, you also get magicka back for 20 seconds, in addition to being healed for X amount of health, based on whether you're light attack or heavy attack. And we have Leeching Strikes. It converts into a stam ability, which is the opposite of siphoning attacks. And instead of just magicka, it doesn't give us magicka, it gives us stamina back upon expiration of the skill, and also on each light attack in the skill. In my opinion, as a PvE tank who's pretty much done all the content, in my opinion, this is really going to depend on your stats and what kind of content you're doing. So if you think you're going to go for a more magicka heavy content, or you're going to be leaning more towards more magicka usage, and your stats aren't built to handle your the lack of magicka sustain for the content, I would recommend siphoning attacks. If you have a lot of magicka recovery, like let's say you have magicka recovery glyphs, you're running the Atro Mundus, then you shouldn't really need more magicka sustain, so I would go with Leeching Strikes. And stamina is pretty important overall. I would argue a little bit more than magicka, because you can also block and heal with stam, like with vigor. So for most scenarios, I think with my setups and so on, I think I'll go with Leeching Strikes. I'm going to put this on the back bar since we don't really need to have it on the front bar. And we have Drain Power. Now this is another interesting skill we can bring to 4-man content, or potentially trials, if the need arises as a Nightblade tank. So we have Drain Power, siphon the vigor from your enemy's blood. I see what they did there. Dealing X amount of magic damage. If an enemy is hit, you gain major sorcery. Not really great for tanks yet, so we'll look at the morphs. Power Extraction converts to a stamina ability. Now this is a big no-no. It's almost 3,000 stamina cost, and you're going to be using this in trash. And there's a lot of things hitting you every half second to second in trash, and I don't think this is a very good idea to convert into a stam ability. So we're going to be looking at Sap Essence, which is a magicka cost ability. Definitely slightly more expensive than Power Extraction. However, it does give you a heal for your entire group, and the heal is stronger for each enemy hit. And unfortunately, unlike Dark Cloak, which scales off your max health, it does scale off of your max magic and spell damage and so on. But it is an interesting skill to bring if you're going to, again, go with a half tank, half DPS kind of setup. But yeah, I would go with Sap Essence for trash. Catalyst, after drinking a potion, you gain 10 ultimate. This is one of the strongest passes in the game in general, for not just the Nightblade, for just in general, the Catalyst. You get up to 20 ultimate once you put both points in the Catalyst. And it's like 20 ultimate, it's pretty significant. That's the difference between life and death for certain fights. And we have Magicka Flood. Increase your max magicka by 4% while siphoning ability is slotted. So that's pretty nice to have, especially on the back bar. So as you can see, guys, we already have Soul Siphon and Leeching Strikes on the back bar. So it's gonna give us max magicka by 8%. So even if you take off Soul Siphon, you're gonna get an 8% max magicka boost on your back bar just from slotting Leeching Strikes, which is pretty nice because on the back bar later we're going to be putting more magicka use abilities. Soul Siphoner passive, increase your healing done by 2% for each siphoning ability slotted, and it's going to be up to 3% actually, and it's going to be interesting to see. Transfer, casting a siphoning ability generates 1 ultimate. This effect occurs once every 4 seconds. But it's 2 ultimate with 2 points put into the transfer passive. And this is also a significant thing because you're stacking Catalyst, which is 20 ultimate from just drinking a potion, with transfer, which is 2 ultimate every 4 seconds if you cast a siphoning ability, which is pretty significant because you also have to take into account that this skill right here is encouraging you to light attack on whichever bar you want to light attack. And light attacks, of course, as we know, generate ultimate. and it's already depending on your race as well. If you're a Nord, this is a pretty significant passive to have. But yeah, that is it for the skill bar setup in terms of the class skill lines. As you can see, lots of things we're considering, but we're not actually putting in yet. That's because we have to look at the one-handed shield skill line and the bow, Destro staff, and so on. Alright, so unlike the Necromancer tanks we reviewed in the previous guide, races for Nightblade tanks in PvE is going to be actually a bit more diverse. In the previous Necromancer guide video, I recommended Breton, Imperial, and Nord as the 3 best races, but for Nightblade tanks in PvE, I would highly recommend going with Argonian, Nord, Imperial, Breton, Orc, and High Elf. So there's a lot of reasons why Nightblade tanks can go with this many races. So I'm going to be explaining it by race by race. So Argonian, why Argonian? In comparison to the Imperial or Nord passes, Argonians may now seem a little lackluster, but their potion passive is still pretty damn strong. And playing into the idea of using 3 alchemical acceleration enchantments on 3 infused jewelry, Argonians are probably going to be the best choice for that kind of build, because they do get to choose what potions to run. Now there are potions such as the potions with Columbine, Dragon Blood, and Butterfly Wings that give you max health and max stand back, and also heals you over time. But they will still get magicka back from potions like that. If they use like Essence of Lingering Health, they also get a tri-stat max health boost from that potion as well. Whatever they use, they get all their resources back, and that's a pretty significant thing, especially with a 21-second potion cooldown, especially when some of the effects of the potions only last for 14 to 15 seconds. So this is a pretty good race to consider for PvE Nightblade tanks. Very strong race to consider. Nord is also a really strong race, just because not of their physical and spell resistance mitigation, that's just free. They also do get a ultimate generation passive that allows them to generate ultimate pretty fast, and stack that on top of the Nightblade ultimate generation that I showed you guys from passives and so on. It's pretty insane. And the raw mitigation is also pretty insane. Lets you get away with certain other sets in both Trials and Forming content. And Imperial, very solid race still. I don't think it's as strong as the Nord in the PvE Nightblade case, but it is still a very solid, sustained race. And it will allow you to play around with your stats a little bit more, as it does offer a bit more max health than the Nords. Bretons, again, magicka is going to be a heavy use in the Nightblade tanking class, so it's going to be a matter of, do you want the magicka cost reduction and the raw magicka damage mitigation from Breton, or do you want more health from Nord Imperial, and do you want more ulti-gen, or do you want more sustain for overall skills? So Breton is still a consideration as a class, not as strong as these first 3 we just discussed. Orc. Now, a lot of you are going to be like, whoa, why Orc? So just like Orc is pretty much going to be applicable to pretty much every tanking class, because in Trials, depending on how organized your raid teams are, what your goals as a raid team is, to push score, whatever, you may need to DPS as an off tank, and you may need to have DPS specs or setups available, and Orcs do get that weapon damage and so on. And that's pretty much it. That's pretty much why you wear Orcs. If you guys actually watched this video I had on my channel a month or so ago back, where I failed as a tank, the other tank was actually an Orc Nightblade, I believe, and he was tanking Skin Rye, and we just burned the shit out of that boss. Put the video in the bottom left corner for you guys to watch. But that's pretty much why Orcs are going to pretty much be applicable to trial tanks in general. Trial off tanks in general. And Altmer High Elf, well, this is a weird choice, Nephis. Why did you pick High Elf? Because if you want to go with a more damage hybrid tank build in Forming content, it's probably best that you do it with a High Elf. They do get more spell damage. They also do get stamina back, because or depending on your stats actually, they do get stamina or magicka back, whichever is lower every time you use a class ability. So that's another nice form of sustain. And just like Brens, they do get 10% max magicka boost as well. So that's another race to consider. The other races like Dark Elf, Wood Elf, Khajiit, and Redguard, you can still do PvE Nightblade tanks. I'm just going over what could probably be the best races depending on what you're going to do. But yeah, that's pretty much it for the races for the PvE Nightblade tank. So for the one-handed shield skill line, we're going to have... so they changed Ransack and Pierce Armor slightly, or rather Ransack slightly. Instead of offering minor Resolve, which was the minor passive of Major Resolve, which gives us like 1300 physical resistance, Ransack now gives us minor protection. But Nephis, you already have minor protection on Dark Cloak. Yes, we do. That's why we're actually going to go with Pierce Armor. There isn't real... I mean, it's like if you're going to use Dark Cloak, you're going to be using Pierce Armor anyway. I mean, it doesn't really matter in raids, especially for stamina DPS compositions, if you want to take either Morph, because there's no magic DPS in raid compositions that will, have you make use of Pierce Armor, but it doesn't matter anyway as well, because on the other hand, you have Dark Cloak with minor protection already, and they don't stack. 2 instances of minor protection does not stack, or should not stack. And so we're going to go with Pierce Armor, because we might as well anyway, because of Dark Cloak. And we have Low Slash here as well. And this is going to be another source of ultimate generation as a Nightblade and as a PvE tank. Low Slash, it afflicts minor maim, reducing the damage done by the target it afflicts by 15% for 12 seconds. 50% damage reduction is a must-have for tanks, and it comes in the source of Heroic Slash, which is the morph we're going to take instead of the AoE Low Slash version. And now Heroic Slash gives us minor heroism, granting us 1 ultimate every 1.5 seconds for 12 seconds. That's pretty insane. If you're stacking it again, as I said earlier, with the Transfer Passive, Catalyst Passive, and Lie attacks as a PvE Nightblade, already you have so much ultimate generation. That's the fun part about playing a Nightblade PvE tank. The generation you get, it's pretty insane. And that is it pretty much for the Sword and Board skill line. We do have defensive posture, which we can sort of consider for certain fights as well. For fights where you may need an extra heal, such as Fang Layer hard mode, you can do Absorb Missile because of Durvakun's ice projectiles. Otherwise, you do also have defensive stance, which does the same thing essentially, but it doesn't heal you. It reflects projectiles back at the bosses. So either one would work. But for most cases, I do use defensive stance because it gives us a passive block cost reduction, which helps a lot with stamina sustain, and it also increases the amount of damage we're blocking. So it increases our block mitigation as well. So we're going to be taking that just in case for future fights. The bow, it's going to be run in the same vein as this Destruction Staff, and for those of you who don't know, we're gonna always want an infused 2-handed weapon, whether it's a staff or a 2-hander or a bow. We're gonna need it just to proc the Crusher enchantment on the back bar, because again there was a nerf to one-handed enchantments where the enchantment value is now halved. So you want to get the most out of your Crusher enchant here on the infused staff or bow. So the skills you're going to be taking usually are going to be, Endless Hail for the longer duration, 12 seconds compared to 10 seconds on Arrow Barrage. And we also have Wall of Elements, which is also now 12 seconds on the Elemental Blockade version. So on the back bar, it's going to look like this, typically. And on the plus side, with Lightning Staff or even Ice Staves, for Lightning Staff, you do put things off balance, as it says in the tooltip. It says concussed enemies off balance, and that'll contribute to, Stam DPS doing more damage, because they do get the Exploiter perk from the Ritual Tree, which means that they do 10% more additional damage against off balance enemies. Or if you're using an Ice Staff, you can also use the Ice Staff as a snare AoE, and also a free taunt as heavy attacking with an Ice Staff. Where is it? Heavy attacking with an Ice Staff also taunts enemies. It's basically a free taunt though with a cast time pretty much. And a second consideration from the Destruction Staff skill line is going to be Elemental Drain. I touched upon this earlier with the whole Minor Magicka Steel thing. Where was it? Cripple. Debilitate does offer Minor Magicka Steel, but at a very short duration. So if you have mag DPS in your group and no healer, whatever in 4-man content, you can definitely consider running Elemental Drain. Because of the longer duration. It's like 23 seconds of Minor Magicka Steel. And that's pretty much it for the Destruction Staff skill lane. Rest of the staff, not really a concern. And for armor passives, you're gonna be going 5-1-1, which is five pieces of the same type, like 5 heavy pieces, and 1 medium, 1 light. And this will tie in with how Undaunted passives work. So the Undaunted Metal gives you 2% more max stats per type of armor you wear. So on this guy right now, we're wearing 1 medium, 1 light, and 5 heavy. And that's increasing our max stats by 6%. I recommend this not just for Nightblade PvE tanks, guys. I also recommend this for all PvE tanks. And let's see. That's pretty much it. Again, balance is also a consideration, but you really, depending on how you set up your stats, you shouldn't really need it most of the time. Sigil Order, we get nothing really from it. Thieves Guild, whatever. Going back to the Undaunted skill lines, we do have a few options we can consider, especially for trials. So for 4-man content and trials, we do have Blood Altar to consider, and I definitely go with Overflowing Altar. It offers more heals. So for trials, especially for Veteran Cloudress Tar mode, if you are off tanking or whatever, it is much easier to use it now because it's instant cast as of Scalebreaker. And it also applies Minor Lifesteal and offers a synergy to a total of 7 people in the group. And for 4-man content, if you don't have a healer or whatever, this is also great burst heal in the form of the synergy for the DPS if they get damaged too much. And also, again, offers lifesteal to both you and your group. And since you're encouraged to keep up light weaving as a Nightblade tank because of the use of Leeching Strikes and so on, it's going to be a pretty powerful skill to use. For trials specifically, you can still definitely slot like Shadow Soak, which is go-to morph for, giving free damage for your DPS. So this is going to be more situational than anything. It's really dependent on whether you want to use it or not. Inner Fire, this is going to be our essential range taunt for sure, and they did reduce the cost of it for Scalebreaker, and it is pretty nice. The sustain difference is pretty noticeable compared to pre-Scalebreaker, and there's no reason to not use a range taunt most of the time unless you're confident that you can chain in a lot of adds and keep aggro on them. So we're going to go with the Inner Rage morph, which does not use stamina. And again, this also relates to whether you have a healer in your 4-man content or not, or depending on the fight, if you need to provide the orb based on your group positioning. So Necrotic Orb, Mystic Orb, Energy Orb, whichever orb you use, pretty easy to use as a tank now, since you don't have to spam it, or not spam it, but use it per person. So previously, before Scalebreaker, you had to give out 1 orb per person. Otherwise, other people wouldn't get it. But this patch, they've limited to 1 orb per person, one orb per caster, and now everyone can synergize off of 1 orb. So this allows tanks to keep up orbs much easily, because you just have to throw 1 orb and you're done for 20 seconds. That's definitely a consideration. Alliance War. So Rapids are usual. For the ultimate on the back bar, typically we're going to have Aggressive Horn, because this gives us max magicka and max stamina to yourself and everyone else in the group, whether it's a raid team or a 4-man content team. You and your allies also gain Major Force, increasing your crit damage by 15% for 10 seconds. That is pretty significant. And for the other skills in the Alliance War skill line, there are a couple other considerations here as a Scalebreaker. So we have Vigor, and I would highly recommend going with Resolving Vigor for a lot of 4-man, because Echoing, it's not very strong for a tank, but Resolving is such a huge amount of burst heal for a tank that if you have to use a stand-based healing ability, you're definitely gonna go with Resolving Vigor. I know that some people will say, well, what about Echoing? That heals other people too, but typically people in Forming content also bring their own heals or their own form of damage mitigation like shields. So honestly, if you're alive, things should be going great anyway. Caltrips. Caltrips is another consideration we need to have. We can forget about NT Cavalry Caltrips because it's more for PvP, obviously, because it only affects, you know, players that use mounts, nothing else. Razor Caltrips is going to be applying Major Fracture as of Scalebreaker. And this is a nice utility skill to have because compared to a Dragon Knight or Necromancer PvE tank, you don't really have an innate class skill that offers an AoE Major Breach or Major Fracture. Dragon Knights have Noxious Breath, which is an AoE Major Fracture. Necromancers have Unnerving Boneyard, which is Major Breach and Major Fracture in an AoE form. So Caltrips is definitely gonna be a very, very interesting skill to have. Razor Caltrips for both Forming content and Trials. And you can see how large the AoE is, and they actually also buff the Snare as well from 30% to 50%. So this can be an easy way to pull aggro on Trash and 4-man or Trials and take your sweet time hunting them basically. And that's pretty much it. For support, there will be times when you need to use Purge depending on the content or the fight. And I would highly going with Efficient Purge. Don't have a very huge max Magicka pool compared to actual healers. So you want the cost reduction morph. There are also times where you may need to use Barrier, especially Reviving Barrier over Horn or Incap. I would probably just go with the Horn because if you're gonna use Barrier anyway, you won't get to use Horn anyway. So definitely this is a huge consideration as well, considering that they slightly buffed the healing done as of Scalebreaker. And Guard, this is very specific. But this will depend on if your group wants you to guard someone or not. And we all want to make sure we have 2 points of Magicka Aid for the 10% Magicka Recovery for each support ability slotted. Okay, so I want to talk about gear. I'm not really going to go into specific builds or whatever or setups that you need to do. That's more going to be for the future, for future videos. Again, as I said at the start of the video, I'll make Nightblade tank build videos and other class build videos. But here, very briefly, we're going to be going over some sets that you will definitely want to consider as a PvE Nightblade tank. Stonekeeper is definitely going to be a huge set for both 4-man content and for trial content. It's a really nice sustain set and a nice heal set as well because, as it says, when you block an attack, you gain an energy stack up to 1 stack per second. When you get 6 stacks, you release the energy, and this happens every 14 seconds after you release the 6 charges. And it's a lot of healing and a lot of nice burst sustain. It also gives a basically a free prismatic enchantment as well, and that helps your max stats quite a bit. Other monster sets we can definitely consider for usage is going to be Ancient Guardian. Now, a lot of people will think, well, why would I use Ancient Guardian over Stonekeeper? Well, there are some instances where you may not be blocking, but you'll still want a form of sustain back from like Magic or Stamina. It's pretty useful in bettering Cloud Rest +3 hard mode if you ever need to use it. I do recommend it for Necro tanking, but also Nightblade tanking as well if you ever need an extra form of sustain in Cloud Rest hard mode. Lord Warden Dusk is going to be your typical group buff set in case your group needs more mitigation. It does provide a nice armor mitigation for your group. It does only apply up to 6 people though, but the one piece also helps you become a bit more tankier. So it's really up to you if you want to use it for certain fights. It will depend also on your group positioning. Malabeth the Scourger, very fun set even after the multiple nerfs over the past. You do get Major Vitality, so that also allows us to not really need to use Soul Siphon because it'll give us Major Vitality while the beam is holding on the attacker. And the effect occurs once every 6 seconds, but the effect lasts for 4 seconds. It's like a 2-second cooldown. And it's a pretty strong set for certain instances. I do highly recommend keeping one set available for your PvE Nightblade tank. Stonekeeper, we already went over that. Swarm Mother. Now, Dragon Knights are very, very good tanks. Probably the #1 tanking class, and they do have a huge advantage in that they have chains. They have a class skill that can just really, really efficiently pull in adds and on trash fights in forming content. But Swarm Mother also gives us a chance as Nightblade tanks to pull those pesky ranged adds in quicker. So this is a consideration for forming content as well. Symphony Blades, same thing, forming content is really, really strong. Nice form of sustain for other people in your group. Troll King, this is gonna be an interesting set to consider for PvE Nightblade tanks. You do heal other people during trash fights through, where is it? Through Sap Essence. So it is a consideration to have. If you are gonna go with the funnel health morph, again, it's another consideration to take into account. Bicosa, I've only honestly found it very useful for Asylum Sanctorium hard mode. If you can, main tank it as a Nightblade tank. So it's gonna affect everything Saint Olms does. There will also be some other trial fights where you may need to use Vicosa as well. So definitely keep this monster set in mind. And for your primary and secondary sets, again, for forming content, you can definitely have Dragon. Gives us a cost reduction to our ultimate abilities, which is going to stack pretty well with the ultimate gain we get from the Nightblade passives, plus the light attacks we're going to be encouraged to do. And our secondary sets can include whatever you need for your group. This will, of course, depend on the content you're doing or the group you're doing it with. Right here, we just have 2 Stonekeeper, 5-piece Dragon, 5-piece Unicorn as a basic setup. But here I'm going to be talking more about traits than the item sets themselves. But if you are interested in the item sets you may need, it will include Dragon Guard, Ebon, Leashing Plate, very fun set, Live Wire, Claw, Unicorn, Reynolds Resolve is also an interesting set too, especially for Nightblade tanks, because again, you have to remember that Merciless Resolve is actually a pretty decent amount of mitigation, and if you stack that with Reynolds Resolve, that's like, wow, that's that's quite a lot of mitigation. And then you also take into account that this, for Scalebreaker patch, you have Immovable, which also increases the amount of block mitigation. And it's just kind of really insane for tanks this patch, especially if you're watching in the future or whatever, that we can do all this crazy stuff. So it's pretty fun to consider. Alkosh, definitely your bread and butter as a tank for trial content. Never ever gonna change unless they change the set itself. And that's pretty much it for sets. Now, I digressed. Let's go on to traits. I always recommend, regardless of what class you're tanking on, or depending, for most people, I'm not gonna say for everything, but for most people, I do recommend 3 infused on pants, chest, and head, and this will give us a higher amount of max stats from our max stam, max health, max magicka, or prismatic enchantments if we choose to do so, and allow us a greater degree of flexibility in terms of changing up our stats or attribute points. And you don't, in my opinion, a lot of tanks still go 7 sturdy, but I don't really think you need 7 sturdy. You can probably get away with like 4 sturdy or 4 divines depending on the fight. I do recommend 3 infused on the big pieces and 4 sturdy on the body pieces, especially for beginners who may not know how to handle themselves well in terms of tanking in ESO. And for the jewelry traits, now jewelry traits will of course again depend on the fights and what your group wants you to do, and how your stats will compare once you find out, okay, my group wants me to spam purges, so I'll probably do like infused traits on jewelry and put magic recovery glyphs on them. Something like that, right? But for most content, I'm definitely gonna say for PvE Nightblade tanking, definitely do 3 infused jewelry traits and then slap on the alchemical acceleration enchantments. Reduces the cooldown of potion usage by 8 seconds per enchantment. So we have 24 seconds we just shaved off of a 45-second cooldown. It's actually pretty interesting to see. So it's gonna be 21-second cooldown. and that's pretty insane. Like, especially if you're an Argonian. I'm gonna get into races here soon in a bit, but yeah, that's what I wanted to get. I wanted to show you guys the traits and the gear and such, and the enchantments for PvE Nightblade tank. One thing I forgot to mention here though is the sword and board. So your shield trait, it can be whatever you need. The shield is sort of like your extra extra trait. Are you specking more out of tumbling or whatever? Do you have nothing in the sprinter, or do you feel like you need more dodge roll cost reduction? Go with well fitted. Do you think you need to amplify your Mundus Stone effect, whether it's Atro or whatever? Go with the divine trait. Do you want more raw max stat infused? Whatever. For the one-hander passive or one-hander trait, excuse me, we're gonna have decisive. There will be some cases where you might want to try out infused with certain enchantments, like hardening enchantment. But decisive with a poison on the front bar, like drain health or whatever poison that will give you good amount of sustain, like Magicka, will definitely be top tier. So that's a huge consideration to take into account. And on the back bar, I touched on this earlier, we always want an infused weapon, two-handed weapon on the back bar for that Crusher enchantment. I'm going to be showing you guys a general champion point setup. Obviously red and green and blue will depend on your raid composition, what your raid team wants you to do, or what your four-man team wants to do, or what the content actually is. But here's a red and green and blue tree that will pretty much work for 90%, 95% of all the content in PvE. We have 81 to Ironclad the Steed. The 81 Ironclad is a significant damage mitigation source. We have 49 Hardy, 49 Ellie. A lot of dungeons and DLC dungeons have a lot of Magicka, both Magicka based and physical based attacks, which you need to mitigate as a tank. We have 56 thick skin. This can be anywhere between 19 or even 17 to 21% thick skin. Dots on you as a tank is pretty atrocious in some DLC dungeons. And we have 19 quick recovery and 16 heavy armor focus. This will be regardless of whether what race you are or not on this Nightblade PvE tank setup. So, and 19 quick recovery is a nice 5% healing received, and this is gonna play into our Nightblade passes as well. Green tree, we have 56 Warlord. We always want to be able to break free just in case we make an oopsie mistake. Not breaking free and just kind of sitting there stunned is not going to be great for your group, regardless of what PvE content you're doing as a tank. We have 16 in the Sprinter, a base 10% cost reduction into sprinting for dungeons, long dungeons, especially Lair, Marsalok, or long trials. 11 bashing focus, just a basic 7% bash cost reduction. Tenacity, it really depends on the fights too, but generally for most content you don't really need to heavy attack a lot. That's how good sturdy the CP and so on the passives are. Arcanist, 64 Arcanist, this is going to be depending on your enchantments as well, and how much Magicka recovery you already have. So if you have a very low amount of Magicka recovery, 64 Arcanist won't really do much, but again, it's going to go with more Magicka recovery. 64 Arcanist is going to be huge. 51 Tumbling, it's going to be a basic 19% dodge roll cost reduction, and obviously you can spec more out of it depending on what your shield trait is, whether it's well fitted or not, or if your armor traits are well fitted. And we have 72 in the Shadow Ward. With this many points in the Shadow Ward, 23% block cost reduction, you don't generally need any more than this. This will pretty much be your ceiling in terms of your block cost reduction, in addition to however many sturdy traits you have on your body. And that should be enough block reduction to get through pretty much almost all the fights, whether it's Fatmov or Kaj or Veteran Moongrave Feint Hard Moon. This will be a pretty solid perk, or pretty solid amount of points you put into Shadow Ward. And we have 75 Blessed, 75 Elfborn. We're still healing ourselves with Dark Cloak. This does affect it regardless of whether your healing abilities scale off of your max health or not. More than that, whatever. 75 Elfborn, again, this ties in with Essence and other skills we may be using. But overall, you don't really need... a lot of the perks here are not really great for tanks, in my opinion. just in general, the blue tree. The only perk I really like think is the most important. Well, there are a couple important perks like Foresight. When you drink a potion that costs you your next magic ability, it does play into sustain, like Arcane Well and Foresight, whatever. But the most important blue perk from the champion point trees is the Last Stand. When you fall below 20% health, you gain Major Heroism, granting 3 ultimate every 1.5 seconds for 8 seconds. This effect can occur once every 20 seconds, and this has saved a lot of tanks. This has saved me from so many stupid mistakes. That Major Heroism, it's pretty insane. I do recommend having the full 120 points into Ritual Tree. Precise Strikes does affect your Vigor, the amount of Vigor healing done. So that's why I put more into that than I do into Piercing or Mighty, which is kind of relevant as a tank, or as a pure PvE tank. And we have 56 Thaumaturge, which does affect our damage over time abilities, such as Endless Hail, or Wall, or Caltrips. So that's pretty much it for the champion points. At the end of the video, I'll be showing you guys specific skill bar examples. So look forward to that. Anyway, guys, thank you guys so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed learning more about Nightblade tanks in PvE. I will be making more Nightblade tank builds specifically for dungeons and trials in the near future for this patch, and then I'll be moving on to other classes in the future. If you did like the video, please do leave a subscribe on the channel. I always appreciate you guys coming out to watch videos or to my streams and supporting me. I think as of the making of the video, we're pretty close to 5,000 subscribers on YouTube, which is pretty amazing. Can't believe it. And I'll see you guys next time. Stay safe and have fun, guys.